Good evening and welcome alumni, staff, faculty, students, and friends of Oklahoma State University to our 2021 MLK Virtual Keynote Address. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I would like to take a moment to recap what's happened thus far. Yesterday, the university was closed, but the Family Resource Center offered students, faculty, and staff an opportunity to serve on this nationally recognized day of service. 56 volunteers showed up to clean and organize a facility that is used often by the residents of the family and graduate student housing community. The program went so well that our assistant director, Dr. Sear, has already lobbied to have this community service project occur again next year during our day of service. Afterwards, the participants went home to clean up and came back to campus to join community members for a march. Prior to the OSU march, the Stillwater community had a march and made its way to campus and ended at the Spears School of Business carrying a banner that stated, "We share the dream." Drs. Jovette Dew and Clyde Wilson, who are assistant vice presidents for institutional diversity, led the Stillwater community to campus. The banner was then handed off to Dr. Doug Hellenbach, our vice president of student affairs. President Hargis and Dr. Hellenbach provided some inspirational remarks for the crowd of hundreds. Then Kaylin Adams, a senior of Midwest City, majoring in university studies with a minor in Africana studies, sang, "Lift every voice and sing." After the march, we heard from Caleb Booz on the steps of the McKnight Center, who's a senior majoring in applied sociology and just completed his term as Interfraternity Council President. You can find yesterday's playlist on O State TV, which includes all the speeches and the song. I want to acknowledge several departments and colleagues that played a major role in planning this week-long celebration. The MLK Planning Committee consisted of Dr. Elizabeth Carver-Sear, who's an assistant director of family and graduate student housing in the Family Resource Center. Dr. Jovette Dew, assistant vice president for institutional diversity. Michaela Fagan, one of our student leaders, who's majoring in strategic communication, gender and women's studies, and is graduating in May. Hannah Henson, who is our meeting and conference coordinator in housing and residential life. Dr. Aaliyah Marriott, Director of Student Support and Conduct and Deputy Title IX Coordinator. Connor Terry, Academic Advisor for the Spears School of Business. And Tanisha Van Pelt, HR Manager for the Student Union and Dining Services. I also want to recognize the divisions of Student Affairs and Institutional Diversity for collaborating on this project from start to finish. The Spears School of Business allowed us to use their home for the starting point of yesterday's march. The Ferguson College of Agriculture is co-sponsoring our movie for Thursday night at the McKnight Center. Residence Hall Association provided the facial coverings for the march and also co-sponsoring the movie. So keep in mind, the movie is free on Thursday night at 7 p.m. There are still seats available. Also, I want to recognize the McKnight Center and O State TV for also being supportive partners. Now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker to you. Dr. Brandy Thomas Wells is an assistant professor in the history department. Dr. Wells is preparing a book manuscript that analyzes African American women's international interest and activities from the 1890s through the 1960s. Her work illuminates how members of the National Association of Colored Women and the National Council of Negro Women pursued anti-colonial and anti-imperialist agendas, and how they communicated, cooperated, and competed in the overall quest for civil and human rights. The project has received generous funding from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the international chapter of the PEO Sisterhood, among other organizations. Dr. Thomas Wells' essays have appeared in Origins in Women and Social Movements in Modern Empire. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Brandy Thomas Wells to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClinton, for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here as a member of the Oklahoma State University community to honor the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I must thank the Institution of Diversity, the Division of Institutional Diversity, and the Division of Student Affairs for this esteemed honor and all of the great programming concerning this year's events. I am as humbled as I am elated to offer a reflection about Dr. King. I should begin by saying that, like most people here, I learned about King in a number of ways and throughout my lifetime. As a child growing up in the Deep South in Bainbridge, Georgia, I participated in annual events that honored Dr. King's contributions to the civil rights movement, including his work in Albany, Georgia, a town less than 60 miles up the road. Each year, as far back as I can remember, my family woke up at the crack of dawn, bundled up, and joined in commemorative activities. The all-day event started with a march. As a young child, I didn't quite understand why we had to do this and why we had to do it when it was freezing cold, and sometimes when it was freezing cold and raining. After a day of carrying banners and signs, my arms were usually as sore as my feet. In public school, I learned about a peaceable King, usually once a year in January, with a focus on his I Have a Dream speech. I learned that he was assassinated, but not much else. The major points were usually that King had a dream and that I could have a dream too, and that King wanted peace and that he wanted everyone, most especially white Americans and Black Americans, to get along. From my school lessons, I never fully understood why a man who advocated peace and nonviolence died such a violent death. At home with my family, and especially when I went off to college, I learned more about King, a deeper King, and the many sacrifices that were made by other dedicated activists like Ella Baker, Joanne Robinson, Fannie Lou Hamer, and John Lewis. I also learned about the Freedom Riders, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and many other important events. And I realized that King called upon the memory of that when he delivered that famous I Have a Dream speech at the 1963 March on Washington. The speech was not his original address. It was an extemporaneous one, largely brought on by the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, calling out in the crowd, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Undoubtedly, this speech is one of the most famous that King delivered, and it has become synonymous with his vision. But today I want to focus our minds on King's dream by drawing to a fuller articulation of it. It is my hope that today we will deepen a discussion of King's dream by not just thinking about that impromptu delivery, which is of course invaluable, but by focusing our attention on his articulation of this dream that was more developed and laid out in full in writing. One that focuses us beyond King's mountaintop experience there in Washington, D.C., to one where King was at his lowest moment in a deep valley. I believe that a fuller understanding and grappling with King's dream requires us to look at the last book that he wrote, a text that ironically and quite timely he was not on vacation and that he was working as hard as ever. To complete this book, King did something that he had never done before, something that he had never done since the civil rights movement began. He isolated himself by relocating to Jamaica. There, from January through February, with his wife and two colleagues, King sat down and reflected on what had been accomplished thus far in the civil rights struggle and what was left ahead. When the photos that appear here on the screen were printed in the Ebony magazine, King reported that he was not on vacation and that he was working as hard as ever. In fact, he said he would need a vacation after he finished this book. By the time of his writing, the civil rights movement could boast of many victories. Black Americans had claimed victory in Montgomery, Alabama, after a 381-day bus boycott led the Supreme Court to declare the state's segregation laws illegal. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, monumental legislation that prohibited discrimination based on race and sex in public accommodations, employment, and education. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act outlawed discriminatory voting practices, which long prevented many Black Americans in the South from having a political voice after, as King put it, a century of terror and evasion. King acknowledged these successes. He was very happy for them, but he admitted that there was a lot left to do. Already, he noted that while the legislation that I just mentioned had been achieved, there was a large gap between language and implementation, between language and enforcement. And he noted backlash of varying types. The Confederate battle flag had made an incredible comeback after the 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. And King and the rest of the nation witnessed one civil rights activist assassination after another. King recalled that at a march in Chicago in August 1966, he and other marchers were forced to endure a rain shower of rocks and bottles and the jeering of thousands of white Americans who waved Nazi flags. In an interview that followed, King, who had participated in dozens of civil rights marches in the South, expressed that he had never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today. While King discussed this hostility and this hate that was very much present in his lifetime, he also turned to the lessons of history. King knew and reminded his audience that the history of injustice in the United States was long, and that understanding it meant beginning with the history and the experiences of Indigenous peoples. As he so often did, King argued that, quote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society." Restructuring this disfigurement is what King was thinking about in the year before his death, and he wrestled with those matters head on. King hoped to teach readers that the absence of brutality and unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice, and that to stay murder is not the same thing as to ordain brotherhood. Indeed, King pointed out that while some white Americans had been content, in his words, to somewhat wrestle the whip from the hands of Southern sheriffs, they were loath to recognize and address the population's other issues, especially economic ones. King concluded that many white Americans had moved to treating other races with decency. Still, they had not moved to the next and the necessary step of treating them equally. Indeed, King noted with deep disappointment that already in 1967, many white allies of the movement were all too eager to call for peace and to seek common ground with white supremacists. Indeed, the King, who had in 1963 had a dream that all white boys and white girls could hold hands as brothers and sisters, noted that 4 years later, far too many white Americans concluded that Black Americans were asking for too much. Thus, King in 1967 was still calling for freedom to ring from the mountains of New York to the curvaceous slopes of California to every hill and molehill of Mississippi. In this final work, King also spoke directly to Black Americans, as he noted that continued betrayals and disappointments had led to a call for a separatist as well as a more radical movement. He addressed head-on the ongoing rebellion in places like Los Angeles and Detroit, as Black Americans in these cities who had been prevented from achieving even a modicum of the American dream responded in, quote, fire, frustration, and rage. While King strongly disavowed these actions, he sought to explain that their birth was because the nation had yet to address its deep racial dilemma. King, the visionary that he was, laid out a plan for Black Americans to move forward, encouraging them to unify as a group and to develop the rugged sense of somebodyness. While he knew that slavery and segregation had led many to question their worthiness, he encouraged them not to allow an oppressive society to shackle their minds. He called for them to believe in their beauty and their own abilities, and to continue to practice the rights they had while non-violently working for those they did not. He also encouraged them and the nation more broadly to pay attention to the issues that were happening around the world, as these problems often mirrored and were intertwined with issues occurring at home. In the final chapter of his book, entitled World House, King fully articulates his dream. And his dream was that of the beloved community, a society based on justice, equal opportunity, and love. As King told the annual meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference later that year, the love that he was talking about was not, quote, emotional bosh. It was a correction to and a stance against everything that stands in the way of justice. There in that speech, as he had in the book, King contended that unless the United States truly committed itself to justice, it would continue to experience chaos. Chaos that he covered in history lessons and chaos that he covered in his discussion of the world around him in the 60s. It is easy to see that 60 years later, chaos is still with us. In our lifetime, and especially in the past year, we've come face to face with it. 2020 saw a global pandemic and a divisive presidential election. It saw nationwide and global protests sparked by the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, to name just a few. We have seen and we continue to see hospitals that are filled to capacity. Nearly 400,000 Americans who've died from COVID, and staggering unemployment as families are faced with daily anxiety about how they will feed their children or how they will keep the lights on. Then on January 6th, a violent mob laid siege to the US Capitol as Americans and the whole world watched in panic and bewilderment. What will become of our nation? What did this say about our nation? As our knowledge of this event grows daily with never-ending news coverage, we've just started the spring semester here at OSU. OSU students, staff, and faculty are trying to continue with the business at hand and commit ourselves to doing the important work for ourselves, our families, and our communities. But most of us would agree that these times are chaotic. And for some of us, it might be too easy to conclude that the arc of the moral universe is in fact not bending toward justice. Luckily for us, King tells us what to do, even now, providing the answer to his own question, where do we go from here? We go towards the beloved community, which, as King tells us, is the opposite of chaos. While this concept was coined in 1913 by Josiah Royce, an influential philosopher, King took hold of it and developed it over the course of his activism. In one of his first published pieces on the Montgomery bus boycott, King declared that the outcome of this movement had to be reconciliation and redemption, which would lead to the creation of the beloved community. In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote about it with the notable quote, "I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." In many writings, King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, revealed that they viewed the civil rights movement as a microcosm of the beloved community, one where people of all ages, all walks of life, all races and ethnicity came together to embrace the common cause of moving the nation towards racial and economic equality. But the beloved community was never just about people living in the United States. The beloved community is a worldwide community with equity for all, where international disputes are settled by reconciliation rather than war, and where poverty, hunger, and homelessness cease to exist. These are the more in-depth lessons that I came to know as I continued to learn about King. And I began to understand how all-encompassing his dream was. And finally, I was able to answer questions that plagued me as a youth. Questions of why a man who held firm to nonviolence and interracial activism, who, quote, just wanted everyone to get along, died such a violent death. Questions of why King was arrested nearly 30 times in his life, assaulted on 4 occasions, and had been the victim of an attempted assassination much earlier. Truly learning about King and reading more of his work helped me to reconcile why this activist, why this visionary, who is now celebrated each January, was once declared to be the most dangerous man in America, and who was the subject of a 17,000-page FBI file. I learned of a king who was not a docile gradualist, but one who paid attention to systemic issues and who wanted fundamental change, one who was unabashed in calling for justice. In fact, 2 months after coming back from Jamaica, King delivered one of his most controversial speeches. It was on the Vietnam War. And in it, he labeled the United States as, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. There, as he argued in his forthcoming book, King wanted the United States to undergo a radical revolution of its values. And he contended that it remained committed to racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. In response to King's speech, the same President Lyndon B. Johnson, who led the way for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, rescinded King's standing invitation to the White House. The day after his speech, King was denounced in newspapers across the land, including 168 major newspapers and a leading Black one. Appreciating King's legacy then means that we must grapple with it historically, holistically, and honestly. Unlike the 1776 report, which though released yesterday on the MLK holiday, distorts this leader's legacy by falsely declaring that the civil rights movement turned away from his vision of color blindness and clamored for group rights. But King never called for color blindness. In fact, during his lifetime, he asked the nation to take off its blindfold and to open its eyes to the complicated present and past, which included studying the history of indigenous peoples, a group or groups that were completely left out of the report. And King also had called for the nation to deal with its fraught history of slavery and the continued legacies of this institution. King would never have agreed that slavery was on its way out simply because the United States came into being. Today, as we continue our celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy, we must remember that we do so primarily because of his wife's efforts. In addition to establishing the King Center, just months after her husband's assassination, Mrs. King led the campaign to commemorate his work with a federal holiday. The journey was long. It took nearly 20 years before this holiday was observed in 1986, and another 14 years before all of the states recognized it. After the brutal murder of her husband, Coretta Scott King continued to pursue the beloved community in which she believed to her core. Once in 1985, the King family was arrested at the South African Embassy in DC for protesting apartheid. Until her death in 2006, Coretta Scott King led goodwill missions around the world and served as a speaker at numerous national and international peace and justice conferences and rallies. To honor Dr. King and the King family, I contend that we must commit to learning more about our history. We must learn more about King, the trailblazer, and we must speak as boldly about his dream as he did. King's dream was not merely that the nation incorporate those who it once excluded. Instead, it was one that fully transformed the nation and the world, one that moves us to a higher destiny, a new plateau of compassion, to a more noble expression of humanness. Like King told us in his lifetime, and as the King Center makes clear today, we can do the work. We can build the beloved community. And in this beloved community, racial justice is a cornerstone. In this beloved community, economic justice for all is a cornerstone. In this beloved community, demilitarization is a cornerstone. In this beloved community, access to healthcare for all is a cornerstone. And in this beloved community, access to equal housing and voting is a cornerstone. Now, certainly getting there, King tells us, takes direct action. It takes creative dissent, and it takes community effort. We must be steadfast. And along the way, we have to be sure to treat one another well. To get to the beloved community, we're not just talking about treating other people who don't look like us with decency. We're talking about treating each other equally. We have to make sure that our calls for justice are more than empty slogans and window dressing. Only then can we continue the essential mission of Dr. King's unfinished dream. Only then will we conquer the chaos. Thank you.
Dr. Brandy Thomas Wells, on behalf of the university community, I want to thank you for that historical context of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and sharing the details of his story. Many of us know what he stood for, but many of us do not take the time to really know the details of his story. So thank you so much for taking time out of your days to prepare this speech. And thank you for being our 2021 MLK keynote speaker.
Thank you.
Before we conclude, I wanted to share with you that the committee wanted to provide some opportunities for our students to be directly involved in our week-long celebration. So we created an essay scholarship contest and an art contest. And tonight, I want to share the winners of our essay contest. We had a first, second, third place winner. And so our third place winner, well, first of all, I want to share that the essay question or topic revolved around what would you do or what have you done in regards to making a change with populations that address or include underrepresented, underserved, or marginalized populations. So our third place winner, I'm sorry about that, our third place winner is Caleb Booz, a senior in applied sociology, will receive $500. So thank you, Caleb, for participating in our essay contest. Our second place winner was Shakira Brown. Shakira Brown is a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in forensic science and psychology. And Shakira will receive $1,000. Now, drum roll, please. Our first place winner is Jada Lusk, who is a junior and majoring in biology and a double minor in Spanish and psychology, and she will receive $1,500. So we had 69 students participate in this contest. And so keep in mind that the submissions occurred over the break when classes were not in session. And university administration, including Dr. Jason Kirksey, the Vice President of Institutional Diversity, and donors were so impressed with the turnout and the quality of work that was submitted. Every student outside of the winners will receive a $250 scholarship for taking the time to be a part of this program. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank also the planning committee for reading all of the essays. Now, as our keynote speaker mentioned, referenced Selma, I want to remind you that we are showing the movie Selma at 7 p.m. on Thursday night. It's going to be shown inside and outside on the plaza. So go to our website if you're interested. If you're interested in seeing it on the inside, you reserve in pairs. Right now, we're close to 100 seats that have been filled. We can fill up to 200. So if you're interested, please take some time to do that as soon as possible. I will also, before the movie, announce our winners for our art contest. We had 9 pieces submitted, and today those pieces were placed in the basement of the student union. So please take some time to go look at those, and I will announce the winners on Thursday. That concludes our event for tonight. Thank you, and have a good night.